He was barely more than a boy when he set out to conquer the known world. Tutored by Aristotle, driven by divine ambition, yes, he was Alexander the Great, the man who would bend nations to his will, chase glory beyond the edge of maps, and leave behind an empire that would shape civilization for centuries. His story is not just of conquest, but of obsession, brilliance, and the price of immortality. On June 11th, 323 BC, in the ancient sweltering city of Babylon, a titan breathed his last. When Alexander the Great closed his eyes to the world, the kingdom of Macedon had been forged into a colossal empire. From the Balkans, it swept across Anatolia and Mesopotamia, swallowing ancient Egypt and stretching to the very edges of India. This vast domain now answered to the Macedonians. Known as Alexander III of Macedon, or simply the Great, he was a fearless commander, a brilliant diplomat, and a leader so magnetic he could win the hearts of the very people he conquered. These qualities, however, were an inheritance, a legacy forged in the shadow of his formidable father, King Philip II. Alexander was born in 356 BC, in Pella, the capital of Macedon. 20 years later, he would begin his conquest of lands, then dominated by the Achaemenid Persian Empire, an empire the historian Herodotus called one with the heavens. It was, until that time, the largest the world had ever seen. The Persians governed their sprawling territory through a system of provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a satrap loyal to the great king. Their wealth was so immense, it seemed almost impossible to challenge. They could afford to hire the best soldiers from among their enemies as mercenaries, neutralizing threats before they could even form and ensuring numerical supremacy on any battlefield. Ancient Macedon, Alexander's birthplace, lay in the plains north of the sacred Mount Olympus. The Macedonians shared a common culture and religion with their Greek neighbors to the south, yet the relationship was fraught with tension. The Persians referred to the Greeks as the Ionians across the sea, and the Macedonians as the Ionians with sun hats. In 492 BC, Persia conquered Macedon, turning it into a satrapy. A decade later, the Macedonians were compelled to support the Persians in their invasion of Greece, a betrayal that carved a deep ethnic divide between them. Though Macedon regained its kingdom after the Persian withdrawal, and though it embraced Greek culture, the Greeks never ceased to call them barbarians. In 359 BC, a man of singular ambition ascended the Macedonian throne, Philip II, Alexander's father. Through decades of relentless warfare, Philip would transform his kingdom. He shrewdly de-escalated tensions with Athens by withdrawing his troops from Amphipolis, only to turn his attention to the Illyrians, who had killed his brother. He avenged his family and slew their king in battle. Through a series of strategic marriages, most notably to Olympias of Epirus, Alexander's mother, he secured Macedonia's western borders. Philip now had a free hand, and he would use it to redraw the map of the ancient world, laying the foundations for an empire his son would inherit. While Philip was expanding his dominion, his first wife, Olympias, gave birth to a son, Alexander. At the time, the Persians were preoccupied with reconquering Egypt, which had broken free from their rule. To prevent Athens from lending its powerful navy to the Egyptians, Persian gold funded revolts across the Athenian sphere of influence. Philip, a master of opportunism, saw his chance. He seized the moment of crisis to reclaim Amphipolis, and then marched on the Greek port cities, conquering them one by one. His final prize was Crenides, a city famed for its rich gold mines. Renaming it Philippi, he revolutionized mining techniques, amassing a vast fortune that allowed him to field an army of paid professional soldiers. The political landscape of Greece was a fractured mosaic of rival city-states. A conflict known as the Sacred War erupted when the Phocians seized the sacred treasury at Delphi. This sacrilege plunged the Greek world into a decade of bloody infighting, a chaotic power vacuum that Philip was perfectly positioned to exploit. While his neighbors exhausted themselves, Philip consolidated his power. He marched into Thessaly, forcing it into an alliance with Macedon. He then intervened in the sacred war, maneuvering so skillfully that the Oracle of Delphi itself commanded the Phocians to surrender unconditionally to the Macedonians. When the dust settled, Philip of Macedon stood as the undisputed hegemon of Greece. As Philip forged a new Macedonian kingdom, his son, Alexander, was coming of age. The boy's first tutor was a relative of his mother, the stern Leonidas. But his education was broad, encompassing poetry, the epic tales of Homer, and theater, which he consumed with a ravenous passion. He also received rigorous training in the art of war and military strategy. From a young age, his character was said to mirror that of Achilles, the demigod hero of the Trojan War. Indeed, a powerful myth was woven around him. His mother, Olympias, was a descendant of Achilles, while his father's line was said to trace back to Heracles, and thus to Zeus himself. For the people of Macedon, this royal family was not merely mortal. They were divine. At the age of 13, Alexander's education was entrusted to a man who had been a student of Plato and had returned to Pella to serve as Philip's personal physician, the great philosopher, Aristotle. This was a fateful meeting, a collision of the ancient world's most formidable intellect and its most ambitious conqueror. For 3 years, Aristotle instructed Alexander and his companions not only in philosophy, but also in the arts of rhetoric, debate, and political science. This was more than an education. It was the shaping of a mind destined for greatness. It was the forging of a king who would think like a philosopher and fight like a hero. The year is 340 BC. Philip, ever the expansionist, sets his sights on the Greek port city of Perindus. To govern in his absence, he makes a momentous decision. He declares his 16-year-old son Alexander regent of Macedon. The boy king is thrust into the world of politics. In a grand ceremony before the kingdom's nobles, including the powerful generals Parmenion and Antipater, Alexander assumes his first real power. The message was unmistakable. The line of succession was secure, and Alexander would not have to wait long to prove his mettle. During his father's absence, a rebellion erupted. Alexander, in his first test as a commander, crushed the uprising with ruthless efficiency, signaling to the world that a new military prodigy was rising in Macedon. While Alexander secured the throne at home, his father, Philip, marched through Thrace to the shores of the Sea of Marmara, laying siege to Perinthus. But these lands were now under Persian influence, and the great king declared his support for the city. For Philip, capturing Perinthus meant control over the vital straits connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean. For Persia, it meant losing that control. The first Macedon-Persian conflict had begun. The siege disrupted Athenian trade, drawing them into the fray on the side of Persia. The combined Persian-Athenian alliance handed Philip a rare defeat. Yet, even in failure, Philip found opportunity. He abandoned his ambitions in Anatolia for the moment and turned his gaze back toward a weakened and divided Greece, determined to reshape it under his absolute rule. Before Philip could march on Greece, a Thessalian merchant brought a magnificent horse to the court in Pella. Its name was Bucephalus. But the animal was wild, uncontrollable, rearing and fighting any man who approached. Annoyed, Philip was about to send it away when a young Alexander stepped forward. "What a magnificent horse they are losing, for want of skill to handle him," he declared. Challenged by his father, Alexander made a wager. He would tame the beast or pay its price himself. He had noticed what others had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Calmly, he turned Bucephalus toward the sun, stroked its neck, and swung himself onto its back. He galloped across the field and returned to thunderous applause. His father, filled with pride, famously told him, "My son, you must find a kingdom equal to your ambition. Macedon is too small for you." With the matter of the horse settled, Philip turned his attention to his Greek campaign. In the decisive battle to come, his 18-year-old son Alexander would command the elite cavalry on the left wing of the Macedonian army. Near the town of Chaeronea, the combined armies of Thebes and Athens awaited them. As the battle raged, the Macedonian right wing, under Philip's direct command, executed a feigned retreat. The overconfident Athenians surged forward, creating a fatal gap between them and their Theban allies. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. He unleashed his cavalry, charging into the void and smashing into the Theban flank from behind. The enemy line shattered. Alexander had proven himself a hero, but Philip, ever jealous of glory, charged forward to personally break the fleeing enemy, ensuring the victory was seen as his alone. The Battle of Chaeronea was a crushing victory. All of Greece, save for the defiant Spartans, now lay under Macedonian dominion. Alexander had tasted his first major battle and demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would define his legend. Just as this new order was being established, news arrived from the east. The Persian king, Artaxerxes III, was dead. This was the opportunity Philip had been waiting for. A crisis in Persia meant he could finally turn his long-held dream of an eastern invasion into reality. But first, he had to secure Greece. He granted autonomy to the conquered city-states and forged the League of Corinth, a grand alliance that unified Greece against its ancient foe, Persia, with Philip of Macedon as its supreme commander. Philip's plans for invasion reached the ears of the Persian satrap of Caria. Seeing the tide of power shifting, the satrap offered his daughter in marriage to one of Philip's sons. For Philip, this was a golden opportunity. The satrapy of Caria, with its capital at Halicarnassus, would serve as the perfect naval base for his invasion. However, Philip proposed his intellectually disabled son, Aridaeus, for the marriage. This slight enraged Alexander, who, goaded by his mother and friends, began to fear for his position as heir. He secretly sent a message to the satrap, declaring that his brother was unfit and that he himself was the far superior candidate. The offer was, of course, eagerly accepted. When Philip learned of Alexander's secret dealings, he was incandescent with rage. His son's rash actions had jeopardized a crucial strategic alliance. This explosive incident was merely the first sign of a deepening rift between father and son, a chasm that would widen with Philip's next decision, his marriage to a much younger woman, a Macedonian noble named Cleopatra. At the wedding feast, heavy with wine, Cleopatra's uncle Attalus raised a toast, praying to the gods for a legitimate heir to the throne. The insult was clear. Enraged, Alexander hurled his cup at the man, shouting, "You villain! Am I then a bastard?" Philip, drunk and furious, drew his sword and lunged at his son, only to stumble and fall. Alexander jeered. Here is the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another without falling. The insult from Attalus had ignited a firestorm, just as he had intended. His goal was to diminish Alexander and increase his own influence at court. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was driven into a fury and fled the country to her brother's kingdom. Alexander, feeling betrayed by his father's drawn sword, left with her. After a period of reflection, Philip, realizing he needed his brilliant son, sent for him. He offered forgiveness and invited the now 20-year-old Alexander back to the palace, seeking to mend the rift. Attalus, the architect of the conflict, was not punished, but was instead sent away to the east with General Parmenion and 10,000 soldiers to begin the initial phase of the Persian invasion. Alexander returned to the palace, but he was isolated. His mother remained in exile, and his closest friends had been banished from court. Philip knew that Olympias was the primary force, stoking his son's resentment. In a calculated move to placate her and her powerful family, he arranged a marriage between his own daughter and Olympias's brother, King Alexander of Epirus. Philip was eager to join his army in the east and planned to leave Alexander as regent once more. With all his political troubles seemingly resolved, he organized a grand festival in the old capital of Aigai to celebrate the wedding and his imminent departure. The theater at Aigai was packed with a jubilant crowd. All eyes were on a grand procession of statues depicting the 12 Olympian gods. At the end, a 13th statue was carried in that of Philip himself, a brazen declaration of his own divinity. Dressed in a white cloak, he was ready to make his grand entrance, but a shadow from his past lurked in the wings. A man named Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, had been brutally assaulted by men loyal to Attalus, Clotalus' uncle. Pausanias had pleaded with the king for justice, but Philip, unwilling to punish the powerful Attalus, had simply offered Pausanias gifts and a promotion. For Pausanias, this was no justice. It was a profound insult to his honor. His quest for justice denied, Pausanias' grief festered into a burning desire for revenge. He began to plot the king's assassination. Concealing a dagger beneath his cloak, he lay in wait at the entrance to the theater. As Philip approached, ready to greet the adoring crowd, he waved his guards back, striding forward alone. In that moment of vulnerability, Pausanias saw his chance. He lunged from the shadows, plunging the dagger deep into the king's back. Philip fell to the ground. The assassin sprinted for a waiting horse, but as guards gave chase, his foot caught on a vine. He tumbled to the earth, where the king's men fell upon him, killing him instantly. While this is the official account of Philip's death, the specter of conspiracy has always loomed over the event. The king had many enemies, and powerful figures stood to gain from his demise. Suspicion would later fall upon those who benefited most, including Alexander himself, who would soon find himself forced to prosecute those accused of his father's murder, all while the shadow of accusation hung over his own head. With Philip dead, the regency of Alexander was seen as a natural transition to his kingship. But the young heir found himself at the center of a political firestorm, with powerful figures like Attalus openly advocating for a different successor. In the chaotic aftermath of the assassination, Antipater, a loyal friend of Philip, acted decisively. He presented Alexander before the assembled nobles in the theater, and invoking the gods, proclaimed him the new king of Macedon. The nobles roared their approval, and Alexander's succession was secured. Antipater and his allies quickly escorted the new king to the palace, dressing him in royal armor. But dissent simmered. Rumors, likely fanned by rivals like Attalus, began to circulate, implicating Alexander in his own father's murder. From his camp in Asia, Attalus posed the most immediate threat, but swift orders were sent to General Parmenion. Attalus and Philip's young wife, Cleopatra, were summarily executed. In Aigai, Alexander orchestrated a magnificent funeral for his father, a grand spectacle designed to quash any rumors of his involvement and project an image of a grieving, dutiful son. During the ceremony, those deemed connected to the assassination plot were publicly executed. Antipater then convened a military assembly where the army, in a powerful display of loyalty, formally recognized Alexander as their legitimate king. This secured his throne, but it also made him beholden to the powerful generals who had supported him. He owed a great debt to Antipater, and especially to Parmenion, who had signed the death warrant of his own son-in-law, Attalus. Alexander repaid this loyalty by making Parmenion his second-in-command and appointing Antipater as regent of Macedon. Philip's death sent shockwaves through Greece, sparking unrest and rebellion in the city-states he had so recently subjugated. Alexander knew he had to assert his authority immediately. He led his army south on a lightning campaign. Faced with a group of Greeks blocking a mountain pass, he demonstrated his tactical ingenuity by secretly marching his troops around their position and appearing behind them. The resistance crumbled. Believing he had secured Greece, he then campaigned north and west, securing his borders before the inevitable confrontation with Persia. But his absence emboldened his enemies. Athens, Sparta, and other Greek cities rose in rebellion once more, their defiance fueled by Persian gold from the new great king Darius III. Alexander faced a perilous moment. At his young age, any sign of weakness or failure could shatter his authority and unravel his father's hard-won kingdom. He chose to act with blinding speed, marching his army directly on the city of Thebes, the heart of the rebellion. The powerful Macedonian war machine was more than the Thebans could handle. Alexander offered them a single day to surrender the instigators of the revolt, warning that he would storm the city if they refused. The Thebans defied him. Alexander unleashed his army, and the city was taken. The brutal sacking of Thebes horrified the Greek world and fueled a deep-seated hatred for the Macedonians, but it served its purpose. It was a terrifying message to all of Greece. Defiance would be met with annihilation. The thought of another rebellion would not dare cross their minds again. With Greece brutally pacified, even Athens, which had supported the Theban revolt, sent emissaries to congratulate Alexander on his victory. He accepted their overtures, knowing that their powerful fleet, combined with potential Persian support, made them a dangerous enemy to provoke. His southern flank was secure. The time had come to turn his gaze eastward, to fulfill his father's ultimate ambition. In less than a year, Alexander had won 3 campaigns, honed his skills as a commander, and cemented his position as king. The path to Asia and to a confrontation with the Persian Empire now lay open before him. A vanguard of 10,000 Macedonian soldiers, led by the veteran general Parmenion, had already crossed into Persian territory. In Persia, the political landscape had been shaken by the death of Artaxerxes IV, leading to the rise of a satrap who took the throne as Darius III. This instability had weakened the empire, creating the very opportunity Alexander needed. His invasion force was formidable: 32,000 infantry, composed of Macedonians, allied Greeks, mercenaries, and archers, and 4,500 cavalry. When united with Parmenion's troops, Alexander commanded a battle-hardened army of nearly 47,000 men. He led his forces across the Hellespont, landing in the legendary region of Troy. Before even stepping ashore, he hurled his spear into the Asian soil, declaring the land won by the spear. For Alexander, this was sacred ground. He believed himself to be a descendant of the great Trojan war hero, Achilles, and he made pilgrimages to the tombs of his ancestors, offering sacrifices to the gods. His primary objective was to march south along the coast, seizing the vital port cities to neutralize the formidable Persian navy and prevent them from launching a counterattack on Macedon. But his plans were immediately complicated. A Persian army, commanded by the brilliant Greek mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes, had already assembled near Troy, blocking his path south. To make matters worse, the Macedonian army had only a month's worth of supplies. The grain-rich lands to the south were not just a strategic objective. They were a necessity for survival. The Persians chose their ground carefully, drawing up their forces on the eastern bank of the Granicus River known today as the Biga River, a terrain that favored their powerful cavalry. In the early days of June, 334 BC, the two armies faced each other across the water. As dusk fell, the Macedonians expected to wait until dawn. But as the Persians prepared their morning sacrifices, Alexander conferred with his generals and made a bold decision. Under the cover of twilight, he led his army across the river. The Persians were caught completely off guard, startled by the thunderous advance of the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander's speed allowed only a fraction of the Persian cavalry to engage. The battle became a chaotic melee. Alexander himself fought at the head of his companion cavalry, famously striking down Persian nobles with his own lance. The Persians, in turn, threw their Greek mercenaries into the heart of the fighting, where many were slaughtered against the unyielding wall of the Macedonian phalanx. It was impossible to break. With their generals falling and their lines collapsing, the Persians were forced to retreat. The Battle of the Granicus was a stunning victory. Alexander, at the cost of very few of his own men, had annihilated thousands of Persian and Greek soldiers, his reputation soaring. The path south and the conquest of Anatolia was now open. In the aftermath of the battle, Alexander displayed the character that would win him the loyalty of his men. He ordered that his fallen soldiers be buried with their full arms and armor. He personally visited the wounded, listening to each man's story of the battle. For the families of the dead, he granted a full exemption from taxes. With the Granicus campaign having lasted 2 weeks, he had only 15 days of food remaining. He sent his heavy siege equipment by sea along the Aegean coast, allowing his army to move with incredible speed. The port cities of Smyrna and Ephesus fell without resistance, cutting off Persian supply lines by sea and securing the Macedonian coast from any threat of invasion. For Alexander, these initial conquests were a defensive necessity. The next major obstacle was Sardis, the capital of the Lydian satrapy and the most important Persian administrative center in the west. The city was protected by massive walls and a formidable citadel. Though the Persian military presence was not overwhelming, the fortress was strong enough to withstand a long siege. However, Alexander's control of the fertile surrounding lands meant he had a steady supply of provisions, while the defenders inside the walls would face starvation. This strategic advantage proved decisive. The city of Sardis, with its immense wealth, surrendered to Alexander without a fight. His momentum seemed unstoppable, but soon the commander of the city of Miletus declared his intention to resist. A Persian fleet mobilized to relieve Miletus, but they were too late. The Macedonian navy had already captured the nearby island of Lade, blockading the city. The Persian ships could only advance as far as the Mycale Peninsula. Alexander established his headquarters in the city of Priene, directly across from Miletus, giving him a commanding view of the entire theater of operations. From there, he launched a swift assault. His siege engines battered the walls, creating breaches through which his soldiers poured into the city. Despite a fierce defense by Greek mercenaries, Alexander's forces quickly overwhelmed them. The Persian navy could only watch, helpless, as Miletus fell. Not even 4 weeks had passed since he first set foot in Asia, and already most of the Aegean coast was under his control. With the fall of Miletus and its fertile lands, Alexander's supply problems were solved. He was now in a much stronger position to push deeper into the Persian Empire. However, one last, crucial port city remained to be conquered: Halicarnassus, the capital of Caria, known today as Bodrum. As long as the nearby island of Rhodes remained in Persian hands, their powerful fleet posed a constant threat to Greece and Macedon. Recognizing the superiority of the Persian navy, Alexander made a daring decision. He would attack Halicarnassus not by sea, but by land. Yet this was a monumental challenge. The city was encircled by heavily fortified walls, with strong citadels crowning every hill. The city's defenses were not the only obstacle. Inside, elite enemy troops were strategically positioned at critical points. In a surprising and seemingly counterintuitive move, Alexander dismissed his own navy, sending the ships home. He believed the fleet was more of a financial drain than a strategic asset, a clear signal that he intended to rely solely on his land forces. He launched his initial assault from the east at the Mylassa Gate. His men worked to fill the 7-meter-deep moat, hoping to bring siege towers to the walls. But they were met with a relentless barrage of arrows and stones from Persian catapults, which could strike with deadly accuracy from 400 meters away. The Macedonian advance was stalled. Forced to adapt, Alexander brought up his own siege engines from Miletus, finally leveling the playing field. Under a hail of projectiles, his soldiers managed to reach the walls and, using battering rams, smashed a breach in the fortifications. But as they poured through the gap, they were met by a wave of defenders holding torches. On the Persian commander's signal, the city gates swung open, and enemy soldiers charged out, attempting to set fire to the Macedonian siege machines. Alexander found himself fighting on two fronts, directing his men to extinguish the flames while simultaneously pressing the attack. The clash was ferocious, a chaotic symphony of battle cries and clashing steel. The Macedonian soldiers, caught off guard by the fierce counterattack, began to fall. The tide of the battle turned when the Persian general Memnon was seen leading a charge from the northern gate. Even Alexander seemed momentarily uncertain. The defenders were on the verge of victory, but in reserve, Alexander held a unit of his father's most seasoned veterans. These old warriors, who had fought for Philip in countless battles, now threw themselves into the fray. Their experience and discipline instantly changed the momentum of the siege. The combined force of young and veteran soldiers launched a new counteroffensive, driving the Persian defense back behind the city walls. As night fell, General Memnon and his remaining forces were compelled to retreat to a small, highly defensible area known today as Bodrum Castle. The next morning, Alexander entered the city and walked the streets of Halicarnassus. He was awestruck by the sight of the mausoleum, a magnificent 55-meter-high marble tomb built for the city's founder Mausolus, and considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though most of the city was now under his control, the enemy held the castle, supplied by sea, and remained a persistent threat. The siege of Halicarnassus, while technically a Macedonian victory, was a bloody and incomplete one. It remained, in Alexander's eyes, a bitter failure. With the coast largely secured, Alexander was determined to push eastward into the heart of Anatolia. A great artery known as the Royal Road stretched from Sardis all the way to Susa in Persia, dotted with caravanserais every 20 kilometers where travelers could rest and resupply. Alexander saw this road as his lifeline, a pathway to facilitate his eastern campaign. He sent his general Parmenion ahead to capture the strategic city of Gordian. Parmenion took the city without a fight. Alexander, meanwhile, turned his attention to the regions of Caria and Lycia, intending to secure the remaining port cities along the coast. The conquest of this shoreline was essential to completely neutralize the Persian navy. As he marched through the region, Alexander was captivated by the stunning natural beauty, unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. After subduing the port cities of Caria and Lycia, he reached the Gulf of Pamphylia, known today as the Gulf of Antalya, and set foot on its perpetually green shores. He advanced as far as Side, but the local population began preparing a defense, and the northern mountains cut off his communication with Parmenion. Sensing the situation turning against him, he left a garrison inside and turned back. He then targeted the city of Aspendos, which, hearing of his approach, surrendered without a fight. With the southern coast pacified, Alexander marched north to rejoin his commanders at Gordian, the city Parmenion had already secured. Along the way, he laid siege to every town in his path. The inhabitants, already aware of his fearsome reputation, and with no hope of Persian reinforcements, offered little resistance. Upon arriving in Gordian, Alexander settled in to await reinforcements from Macedon and the summer harvest. The Persians, though avoiding a direct confrontation, were not idle. General Memnon led a counteroffensive, successfully retaking several cities in the west with the help of local uprisings, threatening to cut off Alexander's reinforcements. While in Gordian, Alexander was confronted by a legendary prophecy. According to the oracle, an ancient ox cart was tied to a post in the city's temple with an incredibly intricate knot. The prophecy declared that whoever could untie this knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Before the eyes of his Macedonian soldiers and the local Phrygians, Alexander stepped forward to attempt the challenge. Success would immeasurably boost his prestige and inspire his troops for the great conquest that lay ahead. But after struggling with the complex tangle of ropes, he grew impatient. In a moment of decisive genius, he drew his sword and, with a single powerful stroke, sliced the knot in two. Turning to the astonished crowd, he declared the Gordian knot undone. Meanwhile, a twist of fate favored Alexander. The formidable Persian general Memnon, who had finally convinced King Darius to commit to a single, decisive battle, suddenly fell ill and died. With his most capable opponent gone, Alexander was free to advance east. He marched out of Gordian, following the royal road south towards the Mediterranean. He crossed the Taurus Mountains and entered the region of Cilicia. The Persians, in a desperate attempt to slow him down, planned to burn the harvest, denying his army sustenance. But Alexander's movements were so swift that he arrived before they could act. After forcing the Cilician gates, his next target was the regional capital, Tarsus. Rejecting the main road, Alexander chose a treacherous mountain path, a shortcut that brought him to Tarsus with breathtaking speed. Once again, his rapid advance caught the Persians unprepared. They had no time to destroy the city or its vital grain stores. Tarsus fell intact. As these events unfolded in the west, King Darius was amassing a colossal new army in Babylon. This time, he would lead it himself. A skilled horseman and archer, Darius summoned forces from every corner of his vast empire: Persians, Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Armenians, Cappadocians, and even Greek mercenaries. This grand army, lavishly equipped and numbering an estimated 100,000 men, was assembled for one purpose: to crush Alexander in a single decisive battle and reclaim all lost territories. In the final days of October, 333 BC, Alexander's headquarters were in Tarsus. He had dispatched his general Parmenion to the coast at Issus, later to be renamed Alexandretta in his honor, to secure the western side of the Belen Pass. Darius and his grand army were positioned on the eastern side of the Amanus Mountains, at the other end of the pass. A tense standoff ensued. Both commanders adopted a defensive strategy, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Patience wore thin. Finally, Alexander could wait no longer. He marched out of Tarsus to join Parmenion, moving south along the coast. Darius, learning that Alexander was on the move, devised a new strategy. He marched his army north, aiming to intercept Alexander before he could link up with Parmenion, hoping to defeat the smaller isolated force. But in one of the most remarkable coincidences in military history, the two armies passed each other, separated by the Amanus Mountains, each unaware of the other's movement. By the time Darius reached the northern end of the range, Alexander had already slipped past him along the coast and joined Parmenion. Realizing his error, Darius turned southwest, marching on the port city of Issus. Unbeknownst to him, Alexander had left his sick and wounded soldiers there, believing the area to be secure. Darius seized the city and had every one of them put to the sword. Alexander was stunned to learn that Darius was now behind him, cutting off his lines of communication. He had no choice but to turn back north. He marched through the night, and by dawn his army was advancing on Issus. The Persians, not expecting him to arrive so quickly, were once again caught unprepared. Darius had hoped for a battle on a wide, open plain where he could leverage his superior numbers and cavalry. Instead, he found himself trapped on a narrow coastal strip, a constricted and uneven terrain that would severely limit his cavalry's effectiveness. This was not the battle he had envisioned. Darius scrambled to form a defensive line. He positioned his forces south of the Pinarus River, creating a deep front of infantry, mercenaries, and archers. His cavalry was held in reserve, intended to sweep around and strike the Macedonian rear. Alexander, meanwhile, skillfully maneuvered his army through the narrow pass and deployed them onto the plain, arraying his forces to face the Persian line. He placed his cavalry near the sea, his phalanx and infantry in the center, and his light cavalry and archers along the mountain slopes, guarding his flank. It was a confrontation of titans, an estimated 100,000 Persians against 40,000 Macedonians. The Battle of Issus was about to begin. The Macedonian army was deployed in a single powerful line, while the Persians were arranged in two deep ranks. Darius, leaving nothing to chance, had even ordered barricades to be constructed along the banks of the Panaris River. Alexander advanced slowly, methodically, his army closing the distance to the river. The two forces drew so close that only 500 meters separated them. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers on both sides offered silent prayers, knowing they were on the precipice of a brutal, decisive struggle. The Macedonians continued their relentless advance, closing the gap to 250 meters. They were now within range of the Persian archers. The sky darkened with the first volley. The Battle of Issus began with a storm of arrows. The Persian archers unleashed a relentless barrage upon the advancing Macedonian line. Soldiers raised their shields, the air filled with the deafening sound of arrows striking bronze, some piercing straight through. Amid the rising war cries from both sides, the battlefield descended into a hellish chaos. In the opening moments, the Macedonians suffered heavy casualties. Their officers fought desperately to maintain formation, as the relentless advance brought them deeper into the kill zone. As they neared the Persian lines, the archers were forced to pull back, replaced by infantry. Now came the struggle for the river. The Macedonians fought to cross the Panaris, but the riverbed was treacherous, littered with sharp rocks and thick mud that threatened to break the phalanx's cohesion. The Persians exploited every gap that opened in the Macedonian line. However, the Macedonians wielded the sarissa, a pike far longer than any Persian spear, giving them a crucial advantage in reach. Even Darius's elite Greek mercenaries struggled to get close enough to be effective. It was a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. Men fell, blood stained the river, and for a moment the Greek mercenaries managed to breach the Macedonian phalanx, pouring through the gap to attack from the flanks. On the seaward flank, the cavalry of both armies had already clashed. The more numerous Persian horsemen gained the upper hand, pushing the Macedonians back across the river. They were on the verge of breaking through and rolling up the entire Macedonian line from behind. But just as disaster loomed, the tide of the battle shifted. The withdrawal of the Persian archers had created an opportunity. Alexander, at the head of his elite companion cavalry, seized the moment. They plunged through the gaps in the enemy ranks, their speed and momentum shattering the Persian lines. The heavily armored Macedonian infantry followed, crashing into the lighter armored Persians. The Persian front began to crumble. Their infantry and archers were either trampled under the hooves of the charging cavalry or cut down by the advancing phalanx. The second Persian line, pressing forward blindly, only added to the chaos, crushing their own men against the unyielding wall of Macedonian spears and shields. A gruesome rampart of bodies began to form. In the chaos, Alexander rallied his forces, launching attacks on both flanks to relieve the pressure on his beleaguered center. It was in this fierce fighting that he sustained a sword wound to his thigh. Amidst the carnage, the Persian king Darius found himself drawn into the heart of the battle. The horses of his war chariot, wounded and panicked, carried him deep into the fighting. For a fleeting moment, Alexander and Darius locked eyes across the battlefield. Alexander surged forward, desperate to reach his royal adversary, but was blocked by Darius's loyal guards. The great king, fearing for his life and the fate of his empire, made a fateful decision. He turned his chariot and fled. The sight of their king abandoning the field shattered the morale of the Persian army. A panicked retreat turned into a rout, with his own cavalry trampling their comrades in their haste to escape. The battle was over. A desperate pursuit had begun. The chase continued until sunset. The Battle of Issus, which had lasted about 2 hours, was a catastrophic defeat for the Persians. An estimated 20,000 of their soldiers were killed, many of them during the chaotic retreat. Alexander's army, by contrast, suffered around 5,000 casualties. It was customary for Persian kings to travel with their entire court, a mobile palace of luxury and splendor. In his hasty flight, Darius had abandoned his campaign camp, leaving behind not only immense riches, but also his mother, his wife Statera, and his daughters. This was a source of profound shame for Darius, but Alexander treated the royal women with honor and respect, assuring them they would be treated not as prisoners, but as queens. This act of chivalry was a calculated display of magnanimity. It was rumored that Alexander developed a relationship with Queen Statera, and that the child she died giving birth to 2 years later was his. Soon after the battle, Darius sent a letter to Alexander, proposing an alliance on equal terms and offering an unprecedented ransom for his family. Alexander's reply was filled with scorn. He reminded Darius of the Persian invasion of Greece 150 years earlier and accused him of complicity in his father Philip's murder. He declared that there was now only one king in Asia, himself. Following the victory at Issus in late 333 BC, Alexander marched south to conquer the Phoenician coast, a region known as the Levant. 4 key cities stood in his path: Aratus, an island city, the port of Byblus, Sidon, and the mighty island fortress of Tyrus, also known as Tyre. As Alexander advanced, the cities of Aratus, Byblus, and Sidon surrendered without a fight. Only Tyre remained. The heir to the Tyrian throne met Alexander, offering to surrender the city. In return, Alexander announced his intention to offer a sacrifice to Heracles in the city's sacred temple of Melkart. This, however, was a calculated provocation. For the Phoenicians of Tyre, only their own king could make a sacrifice in the temple of Melkart. For a foreigner, even a king, to do so would be a profound act of sacrilege. They offered Alexander another temple, but he was insistent. When they refused him entry to the Melkart temple, he declared it an act of insubordination. He would now take the city by force, earning the right to claim both it and its temple as his own. But besieging Tyre was a monumental task. The city was an island fortress, separated from the mainland by 750 meters of open water. In early 332 BC, Alexander began one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world, the construction of a massive causeway, or mole, across the sea to the island. The siege of Tyre would last for months, a delay that gave the Persians precious time to raise a new army. To build his causeway, Alexander demolished the old city on the mainland, using the rubble to create a land bridge 60 meters wide. As the structure neared the island, the Tyrians sent their women and children to their colony at Carthage. Construction slowed as the causeway reached deeper water and came within range of the archers on the city walls. Macedonian workers were relentlessly peppered with arrows. Alexander supervised the work personally, encouraging his men and rewarding them with bonuses. To protect them, he ordered the construction of 2 large siege towers at the end of the advancing mole. As the causeway neared completion, Alexander's army began to face shortages of food and water, with all supplies having to be brought in from miles away. Moreover, the single causeway provided only a narrow front for his attack. Realizing he needed another solution, Alexander summoned warships from Cyprus and the other Phoenician cities he had conquered, assembling a fleet of over 200 vessels. The Tyrians, with only 80 ships, lost control of the sea. The island was now blockaded from both the north and the south, cutting off all supplies and leaving its people to face starvation. Alexander then brought up ships fitted with catapults, siege towers, and even a battering ram, tightening the noose around the defiant city. With the causeway complete and the naval blockade in place, Alexander ordered an all-out assault. His fleets attacked from the north and south, while the ship-mounted battering ram pounded the city's southern wall until it breached. Macedonian soldiers stormed through the gap, the first to enter the city. The Tyrians fought back with ferocious desperation, hurling not just arrows, but stones and hot sand from the walls. The battle quickly spread through the city streets. After a grueling 7-month siege, Tyre had fallen. The victory was costly. 400 Macedonians lay dead, compared to 6,000 Tyrians. Alexander, in a final act of vengeance, executed 2,000 more and sold the rest into slavery. He then, at last, made his sacrifice to Heracles in the temple of Melkart. The conquest of Tyre gave Alexander control of the entire eastern Mediterranean, shattering Persia's naval power. Darius, desperate, sent a new offer. He would cede all lands west of the Euphrates River to Alexander. General Parmenion urged him to accept, arguing that the vast Persian Empire would be impossible to govern. "I would accept it if I were Alexander," Parmenion famously said. "I too," Alexander replied, "if I were Parmenion." He wrote back to Darius with a simple, chilling message. "There cannot be two suns in the sky, nor two great kings on the earth." Alexander had already conquered Anatolia and the Levant. Now, a new, glittering prize lay before him, the ancient and wealthy land of Egypt. Capturing Egypt was a strategic necessity. The region was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and controlling its grain supply would quell any thought of rebellion back in Greece. Furthermore, Egypt's legendary wealth would fuel his war machine and deny those resources to the Persians. His first major obstacle on the road to Egypt was the Persian garrison at Gaza. The city stood on a hill overlooking the desert, a difficult position to assault. The sandy terrain bogged down his siege engines, and the scarcity of water posed a constant threat. Despite these challenges, Alexander laid siege to Gaza, and after a fierce struggle, captured it. He then marched on Jerusalem, which, after an initial refusal, submitted to his authority. The entire Levant was now his. In the autumn of 332 BC, Alexander began the arduous march across the Sinai desert. His vast army moved along the coast, shadowed by a fleet of supply ships carrying food and fresh water. The 200-kilometer journey was grueling, but made possible by a handful of brackish wells along the route. For the first time, Alexander recognized the immense value of the camel for desert travel, a lesson he likely learned from reading the histories of Herodotus, who had traveled the same path a century earlier. When he finally reached the Nile Delta, the Persian satrap Mezachus offered no resistance. Alexander was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt with a heavy hand, and the people were eager to be free of their yoke. Alexander marched to the ancient capital of Memphis, where the Persian governor surrendered the city and its treasury without a fight. In a masterful political move, Alexander made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods in their own temples, winning the hearts of the populace. He embraced their culture, respecting their traditions in a way the Persians never had. The Egyptian people, in turn, hailed him as their pharaoh and bestowed upon him the title Son of Ra, the sun god. This divine title resonated deeply with Alexander, as his own family claimed descent from Zeus. He was now, in the eyes of his new subjects, a living god. To solidify his rule and explore his new domain, Alexander sailed down the Nile. He was mesmerized by the ancient grandeur of Egypt, by its towering monuments and profound spiritual traditions. In the spring of 331 BC, he undertook a pilgrimage into the Libyan desert to consult the famed oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. What? He asked the oracle, and what answer he received remains a mystery, but he emerged from the sanctuary with a renewed sense of divine purpose. He spent months in Egypt, a curious delay for a man in the midst of a great war. He founded a new city at the mouth of the Nile, a port that would bear his name for millennia, Alexandria. It was a testament to his vision of a world where Greek and Eastern cultures would merge. While Alexander was in Egypt, Darius was not idle. Having failed to secure peace through diplomacy, he began to assemble another massive army. He sent word to Bessus, the powerful satrap of Bactria, to raise troops from the eastern provinces and march west. Bactria was a crucial region, often governed by the heir to the Persian throne. But with the crown prince now a captive of Alexander, Bessus, a relative of Darius, saw a path to power. If Darius were to fall, he could claim the throne for himself. Nevertheless, he obeyed the summons. In just over a year since the defeat at Issus, Darius had gathered a new force even larger than the last, ready for one final desperate confrontation. With Egypt secure, Alexander marched his army east toward the heart of the Persian Empire. The direct route to Babylon was blocked by a vast desert, so he followed the coastline north through the Levant before turning inland, crossing the great Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Darius, meanwhile, had carefully chosen his battlefield, a wide, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, not far from the city of Arbela in modern-day Iraq. The terrain was perfect for his scythed chariots and his numerically superior cavalry. He did nothing to impede Alexander's advance, confident that he had lured the Macedonian king into a perfectly prepared trap. The stage was set for the final decisive battle for Asia. A week before the battle, on September 23, 331 BC, a message reached Darius. His wife, Statera, who had been a captive of Alexander, had died in childbirth. This tragic news was a heavy blow to the Persian king on the eve of his greatest battle. A day before the confrontation, on September 30th, the two armies deployed on the plain of Gaugamela. The Macedonian force was a tight, disciplined formation. The phalanx at its center, elite cavalry on the right, and the rest of the horsemen, under Parmenion, on the left. Fearing encirclement, Alexander arranged a second line of troops in reserve. The Persian army was a vast, multi-ethnic host, with infantry, archers, scythed chariots, and even war elephants stretching for miles across the plain. The events leading up to October 1st are known in detail, but the battle itself is shrouded in obscurity. The clash of tens of thousands of men on the dry plain kicked up a massive dust storm, obscuring the vision of ancient historians and making a precise account of the fighting nearly impossible. What is known is the outcome, a crushing Macedonian victory. Darius, for the second time, fled the battlefield, and his vast army disintegrated, scattering to the east. Some accounts even claim that the Persian soldiers began to flee before Darius did, their morale broken by the discipline and ferocity of the Macedonian veterans. Ancient sources, though likely biased, report staggering casualty figures. Of the 47,000 Macedonians, only around 1,000 to 1,500 were said to have fallen. The Persian army, estimated at 250,000 men, may have lost between 40,000 and 90,000. Regardless of the exact numbers, the scale of the defeat was undeniable. The Achaemenid Empire was broken. In the aftermath, Darius and the remnants of his army retreated to Ecbatana in the lands of the Medes. His flight left the great cities of the empire, Babylon, Susa, and the ceremonial capital of Persepolis, defenseless, ripe for the taking. Alexander's first destination after Gaugamela was the legendary city of Babylon. Famed throughout the ancient world for its splendor and its supposedly impregnable walls, Babylon was a prize of immense strategic and symbolic value. Alexander, however, wished to avoid a bloody siege. He entered into negotiations with the city's satrap, Mazaeus, who had fought fiercely against the Macedonians at Gaugamela. Despite this, Mazaeus recognized that the war was lost. He opened the gates of Babylon to Alexander and became one of his trusted advisors. He counseled the young king on how to win the favor of the Babylonian people, advising him to restore the great temple of Marduk, which had fallen into ruin. Alexander followed this advice. He ordered the temple to be rebuilt, levied no new taxes, and strictly forbade his soldiers from looting the city. These acts of respect and generosity earned him the goodwill of the Babylonians. On October 22, 331 BC, he made his triumphal entry through the Ishtar Gate. The city, with a population of over 100,000, was a spectacle the Macedonians had never imagined. Citizens climbed onto rooftops to catch a glimpse of their new king. Nobles lined the streets, offering lavish gifts. Alexander was fascinated by the Babylonians' advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, a wisdom that would later greatly influence European science. From Babylon, he marched on to Susa, another of the empire's great capitals, which also surrendered without a fight. The fall of the great cities hastened Darius's decline. But for Alexander, the ultimate prize was Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. Capturing it would be the final symbolic blow against the Achaemenid dynasty. He began the march from Susa, a journey that required crossing the formidable Zagros Mountains through a narrow pass. This pass, known as the Persian Gates, was defended by a local tribe fiercely loyal to Darius. Alexander, ever the tactician, split his army. He sent half his forces under Parmenion along the main royal road, while he led the other half on a difficult northern mountain path, planning to reunite on the other side. On his northern route, Alexander encountered the Uxians, who demanded a toll for passage. He feigned agreement, promising to pay the next day. Then, under the cover of darkness, he launched a surprise attack and annihilated them. He pressed on, reaching the Persian Gates on January 19, 330 BC. Here, the Persian satrap Ariobarzanes had built a wall blocking the pass, with his troops positioned on the mountain slopes above. The Macedonians marched into a perfectly laid trap. They were showered with arrows, stones, and massive boulders rolled down from the heights. Suffering heavy losses, they were forced to retreat. That night, a local prisoner revealed the existence of a secret path that bypassed the Persian defenses. With no other option, Alexander took a small force and followed the guide through the treacherous mountain path, emerging behind the Persian army. The defenders were caught in a pincer movement, attacked from the front and rear simultaneously. Their lines shattered, but Ariobarzanes managed to escape and fled back to Persepolis. His reprieve was short-lived. Alexander reunited with Parmenion and marched on the capital. He then gave an order that has been debated for centuries. He unleashed his army on the city, permitting them to loot and kill at will, sparing only the royal palaces. Persepolis was immensely wealthy, but the sacking was an act of brutal, calculated terror. For 4 months, his army occupied the city, waiting for winter to pass. While Alexander wintered in Persepolis, Darius was in Ecbatana, desperately trying to raise yet another army from the eastern satrapies. Despite 2 catastrophic defeats, his authority was still strong enough to command loyalty. Alexander, meanwhile, prepared for the final hunt. Before marching out, he gave one last fateful order. The great palace of Persepolis, the symbol of Achaemenid power, was to be burned to the ground. It was an act of vengeance for the burning of Athens by the Persians a century and a half earlier. The ancient feud was finally settled in flames. As Alexander advanced on Ecbatana, he received word that Darius, his reinforcements not yet arrived, had fled the city with its treasury. The chase was on. Alexander took a small mobile force and raced after Darius, leaving Parmenion to secure Ecbatana. Darius planned to make a stand at a mountain pass known as the Caspian Gates, hoping to lure Alexander into a trap with a smaller force. But within his own camp, dissent was brewing. His commanders, led by the ambitious satrap of Bactria, Bessus, began to question his leadership. They argued that fate had turned against him and that he should temporarily step down, ceding command to someone else. When Darius refused, Bessus, who commanded more troops than the king himself, seized him and placed him under arrest. As Alexander reached the Caspian Gates, he learned from Persian deserters of the betrayal. He pushed his men even harder, racing to intercept the conspirators. More fugitives brought news that Darius was now a prisoner, and that Bessus was willing to hand him over to Alexander. This placed Alexander in a difficult position. Executing a defenseless king would tarnish his honor, but allowing him to live could inspire future rebellions. The ideal scenario, he realized, was for Darius's own men to kill him. This would allow Alexander to cast himself as the avenger of the rightful king, winning favor with the Persian people. As Alexander's force closed in, Bessus and the other conspirators realized they could not escape with their royal prisoner. In a final act of betrayal, they stabbed Darius repeatedly and left him for dead in a wagon. Bessus, now styling himself the new great king, fled east. When Alexander arrived, he found Darius dead or dying. He now had a new mission: to hunt down the usurper Bessus and punish him for the crime of regicide. In a masterful stroke of political theater, he arranged a royal funeral for Darius, burying his fallen enemy with the honors befitting a king. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was the legitimate successor to the Ecumenian throne. With Darius dead, Bessus fled back to his home province of Bactria. There, he declared himself the new Persian king, taking the name Artaxerxes V. Alexander. Before he could pursue the usurper, had to deal with a crisis within his own ranks. A plot against his life was uncovered, and the son of his most trusted general Parmenion was implicated. The trial of Philotas, whether he was guilty or not, put Alexander in an impossible position. Tensions were already high among his senior commanders, who felt the war had dragged on too long. An acquittal could be seen as weakness, but a conviction would surely enrage Parmenion. In a ruthless political calculation, Alexander had both Philotas and his father, the veteran general Parmenion, executed. It was a brutal act that silenced dissent and consolidated his absolute authority. This internal turmoil gave Bessus valuable time to raise a new army. Alexander eventually resumed his campaign, marching into the heart of Central Asia. He advanced along the Helmand River, through the cities of Kandahar and Ghazni, until he reached the towering Hindu Kush Mountains. Believing Bessus held the main passes, Alexander took a northern route, leading his army through the punishing Panjshir Valley. The crossing took 2 weeks, a grueling ordeal in the thin mountain air. But when he descended into Bactria, he found that Bessus had fled north across the Oxus River. The local population, fearing Alexander's wrath, had refused to join the usurper. Alexander pressed on, his army enduring a forced march across a waterless desert. He reached the Oxus River, a wide and fast-flowing obstacle, and spent days getting his army across. Bessus was now cornered in the city of Nautica. His own allies, seeing that his cause was hopeless, betrayed him. They seized Bessus, tied him up, and left him in a nearby village, sending word to Alexander. The Macedonian king had his men confirm the report, then took possession of the prisoner. With the capture of Bessus, the last claimant to the Achaemenid throne was eliminated. The Persian Empire was no more. Alexander of Macedon was now the undisputed great king of Asia. Following the fall of the Persian Empire, a fierce rebellion erupted in the northern province of Sogdiana. Adherents of the Zoroastrian faith, joined by Scythian warriors, launched a brutal guerrilla war against the Macedonians. They inflicted heavy casualties and even seriously wounded Alexander himself. To control the volatile region, Alexander founded a series of new cities, military outposts in the hostile territory. The rebellion was crushed once, only to flare up again. The Scythians, nomadic warriors who fought with hit-and-run tactics, proved to be a persistent and deadly foe. The war raged for 2 years. A network of new cities eventually cut off the rebels from local support, and the regional leaders were forced to submit to Alexander's authority. In a gesture of peace and alliance, they offered him the hand of a Sogdian princess, the beautiful Roxana. Alexander, captivated by her, and recognizing the political value of the union, agreed. The marriage helped to pacify the region and demonstrated his commitment to fusing the cultures of East and West. With Sogdiana finally under control, Alexander turned his attention to a goal that had long been in his sights: the fabled land of India, the Indus Valley. In the final weeks of 327 BC, Alexander began his march toward the Punjab. The local Indian rulers, hearing of his godlike reputation, saw him not as a conqueror, but as a divine figure, a savior. From his first base, he led a portion of his army north, subjugating the fierce tribes of the Kunar Valley. He sent his commanders, Hephaestion and Perdiccas, with the rest of the army directly toward the Indus River, conquering the cities along the Kabul River Valley as they went. After securing the northern territories, Alexander rejoined his main force at the head of the Indus Valley. He then advanced on Taxila, one of the region's most important cultural centers. As he approached Taxila, Alexander saw a fully armed and deployed army waiting for him. Believing they were preparing for battle, he ordered his own troops to form up for an attack. But the Indian ruler had no intention of fighting. He rode out alone to meet Alexander, offering his surrender and his alliance. Alexander accepted his submission, confirmed him as the local ruler or Raja, and in doing so secured a powerful new ally. But as the monsoon rains began to fall in the late spring of 326 BC, news arrived that another powerful Raja, Porus, had assembled an army on the banks of the Hydaspes River, determined to resist the invasion. Alexander immediately marched southeast to confront this new challenge. He arrived at the Hydaspes to find Porus and his army of about 30,000 men waiting on the opposite bank. Porus's force was smaller than Alexander's, but he had two key advantages: the monsoon-swollen river, which he believed was impassable, and a formidable corps of war elephants. For a time, Alexander was stalled. Porus assumed the Macedonians would be forced to wait for months until the rain subsided. But Alexander was not a man to wait. Under the cover of a stormy night, he secretly marched a portion of his army 30 kilometers upstream and crossed the river unopposed. By the time Porus realized what had happened, it was too late. Alexander attacked from the north, forcing Porus to divide his army to meet the threat. Meanwhile, the rest of the Macedonian army began to cross the river at the main ford, trapping the Indian army in a pincer. Porus unleashed his war elephants, but Alexander had trained his men for this. Macedonian archers and javelin men targeted the elephants' eyes and their mahouts, the drivers. The wounded and panicked beasts became uncontrollable, turning on their own troops and trampling the Indian infantry. Encircled and overwhelmed, 2/3 of the Indian army was destroyed. A ceasefire was called, and the brave Porus was brought before Alexander. Impressed by his courage, Alexander not only spared his life, but confirmed him as king of his own lands, now as a vassal of the Macedonian Empire. In the aftermath of the battle, Alexander founded 2 new cities. One, Nicaea, was built at the site of his victory. The other was named Bucephala, in honor of his beloved horse, Bucephalus, who had died during the campaign. With the Indus Valley now largely under his control, Alexander was determined to march on, to reach what he believed was the end of the world, the great ocean that lay somewhere to the east. He pushed his army onward, conquering several more cities. But the end of the world never came. His soldiers, exhausted from years of marching and fighting, had reached their limit. They began to openly voice their refusal to go any further. Alexander was furious. He still burned with the desire to continue his eastward march, but he recognized a truth he could not ignore. He could not lead an army that would not follow. He pleaded, he threatened, but his men stood firm. In a rare moment of concession, he finally relented. He announced that the great campaign was over. They would turn for home. It was a bitter moment for the 30-year-old king, whose ambition still drove him toward the unknown horizon. For the first time, his will had been broken, not by an enemy army, but by the exhaustion of his own loyal soldiers. For the return journey, Alexander chose a new route, marching his army south down the Indus Valley to the Indian Ocean. This would allow him to conquer the remaining territories along the way. Most of the local rulers submitted to his authority, but he met fierce resistance from the Malians, a powerful tribe who had fortified their main city of Multan. Alexander ordered an assault, and ladders were thrown against the high city walls. In a display of reckless courage, Alexander himself was one of the first to scale the walls. But as he reached the top, the ladder behind him broke, leaving him isolated and exposed on the enemy ramparts. He became an immediate target. Before his guards could reach him, an arrow struck him in the chest, piercing his armor. The wound was severe. Air hissed from it as blood poured out, and he struggled to breathe. He collapsed, losing consciousness, on the verge of bleeding to death. His soldiers, enraged at the sight of their king falling, went on a bloody rampage, slaughtering every man, woman, and child in the city. Panic spread through the Macedonian camp. The commanders feared the worst. An arrow wound to the chest was almost certainly fatal. The entire empire held its breath, believing its king was dead. Then, news spread that Alexander had survived. Few believed it until he was carried to his royal tent, and from his cot raised a hand to salute his cheering soldiers. He then commanded his horse to be brought to him, and with immense effort pulled himself into the saddle. The army erupted in a thunderous ovation. The arrow, it was later discovered, had struck his breastbone, miraculously preventing it from piercing his lung. His life was saved, but the news of his near-death experience had consequences. His vulnerability was exposed. Rumors of his death had already spread, sparking a series of revolts across his vast and newly conquered empire. The most serious uprising occurred, once again, in the volatile province of Sogdiana. This time, it was not the local population who rebelled, but the Greek mercenaries stationed there. Believing Alexander was dead, they decided to abandon their posts and march for home. When they learned he was alive, it was too late. The mutiny was brutally suppressed by loyal Macedonian forces, though a few managed to escape. Once Alexander had recovered, the long journey home resumed down the Indus Valley. He reached the Indian Ocean, but realized his fleet was not large enough to transport his entire army. He made a fateful decision. He would march the bulk of his army overland, through the brutal Gedrosian desert, while the fleet followed along the coast. The march through the Gedrosian desert became one of the most horrific ordeals of Alexander's entire campaign. The army had insufficient supplies, and the barren landscape offered no sustenance. They were forced to slaughter their own baggage animals for food. A sudden winter flash flood swept through their camp, drowning many. The lands that had been won with so little bloodshed on the advance were now exacting a terrible price on the retreat. As he pushed westward, more bad news arrived. Rebellions were flaring up across Persia and India, threatening to unravel his hard-won empire. Upon reaching Carmania, he had the Persian rebels brought before him and executed without mercy. To quell the constant threat of rebellion from his Greek mercenaries, Alexander disbanded them and began to recruit soldiers from the local populations, integrating them into his army. He arrived at Pasargadae, the ancient capital of the Persians, and visited the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Here, he planned to hold a coronation ceremony, formally declaring himself king of Persia in the tradition of his predecessors. But before the ceremony could take place, the tomb was desecrated. The perpetrators were never found, but the message was clear. There were those who would not accept a Macedonian as their king. The coronation was cancelled. From Pasargadae, Alexander continued on to Susa, where he had left many of the royal Persian women who had been captured after the Battle of Issus. Here, in a grand ceremony, he orchestrated the mass marriage of his senior officers to Persian noblewomen. His closest friend and confidant, Hephaestion, a man so close to Alexander that many believed them to be lovers, married one of Darius's daughters. Alexander himself took another of Darius's daughters as a wife. These Susa weddings were a deliberate political act, an attempt to forge a new ruling class by literally binding the Macedonian and Persian aristocracies together. It was a vision of a unified empire, a bridge between East and West. Leaving Susa, Alexander began to lay plans for new campaigns, an invasion of the Arabian Peninsula, an exploration of Africa. But his Macedonian veterans wanted only one thing: to go home. To build his new army, Alexander began training Persians and other local peoples in the Macedonian art of war. This deeply angered his own soldiers, who felt they were being replaced by their former enemies. Their resentment grew when Alexander began to adopt Persian dress and customs, behaving more like an Asian potentate than a Macedonian king. When dissent broke out, he had the ringleaders executed. In a tense confrontation, he told his army that if they would not fight for him, they were all free to leave. It was a masterful bluff. His soldiers, shamed and reaffirmed in their loyalty, pledged to follow him once more. Alexander marched north to Ecbatana. There, amidst lavish feasts and drinking parties, tragedy struck. His dearest friend, Hephaestion, fell gravely ill with a high fever. One day, while Alexander was at the theater, a messenger arrived with dire news. He raced to his friend's side, but he was too late. In October of 324 BC, Hephaestion was dead. Alexander was shattered. He lay by his friend's body for a full day, wailing in grief. He cut his hair, as was the custom, and fasted for 3 days. He channeled his rage and sorrow into a brutal 40-day campaign against unconquered tribes to the east. In his grief, he declared Hephaestion a divine hero, commanding that he be worshipped as a god. This elevation of a mortal to divine status was a prelude to his own final transformation. Already seen as the son of Zeus, Alexander now began to openly adopt the trappings of divinity, wearing sacred robes and commissioning statues that depicted him as a god. From Ecbatana, he made his final journey back to the ancient city of Babylon. The city was home to powerful seers and prophets who had once foretold the coming of a king from the west who would destroy the Persians. Now, those same seers issued a new chilling prophecy. Alexander would die soon after his friend, and his death would occur in Babylon within the year. The prophecies deeply disturbed Alexander. He knew the reputation of the Babylonian seers. Heeding their warnings, he initially camped outside the city, sending the bulk of his army ahead. He asked the priests how he could avert his doom, and they told him he must rebuild the great ziggurat of Marduk. Desperate, Alexander ordered 10,000 workers to begin the reconstruction, working day and night. But his Greek philosophers dismissed the prophecies as superstition, urging him to enter the city. Believing them, Alexander rode into Babylon, openly mocking the priests' warnings. He stayed for a time, planning his Arabian campaign, and then left again, seemingly in perfect health. While he was away, the body of Hephaestion was brought to Babylon for a magnificent funeral. Alexander returned for the ceremony. He ordered a section of the city wall to be demolished, using the rubble to build a colossal funeral pyre, a monument fit not for a king, but for a god. The Babylonian priests, still desperate to save him, enacted a ritual. They found a condemned prisoner, dressed him in the king's robes, and sat him on the throne. According to their beliefs, the scapegoat king would absorb the evil omens. After a few days, the prisoner was executed, and the priests believed the curse had been lifted. But their efforts were in vain. Just a few days later, Alexander fell ill. The seers had predicted his death would fall between the solar eclipse of May 12th and the 8th anniversary of his victory at Gaugamela. Their prophecy proved terrifyingly accurate. On the evening of June 11th, 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great died. Rumors of poison spread immediately. He had many enemies, and he had recently executed several of his own officers. Others claimed his health had been broken by excessive drinking. Modern historians suggest he may have died from a feverish illness like typhoid or malaria. Whether by murder or by nature, the cause of his death remains unknown, but his final 10 days were spent in the grip of a severe illness. As per his will, Alexander's body was embalmed and initially buried in Memphis, Egypt. Later, his general Ptolemy moved his remains to Alexandria, the city he had founded. Today, the exact location of his tomb is one of history's greatest mysteries. Though it is believed to be somewhere beneath the modern city of Alexandria, it has never been found. He left behind no designated heir, no organized system of government. There was no one with the stature or skill to hold his colossal empire together. His most powerful generals were scattered across the vast territory, each with a powerful army at his command. His death made a devastating civil war inevitable. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, Alexander is said to have whispered, "Krat esto," to the strongest. Some believe he was trying to say the name of his general, Craterus. But the man who held the royal signet ring was Perdiccas, who immediately declared himself regent. He assembled the generals. Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant. If she bore a son, he would be the heir. But another general pointed out that Alexander already had a son, Heracles, by his mistress Barsine. Ptolemy argued for a council of aristocrats to govern. Ultimately, the cavalry commanders supported Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother, Aridius, and he was proclaimed king. The infantry commanders objected, leading to brief clashes, but a compromise was reached. Aridius and Roxana's unborn son, the future Alexander IV, would rule as joint kings. Perdiccas, as regent for an incompetent king and an infant, became the true power in the empire. But when he attempted to marry Alexander's sister, a coalition of powerful generals, including Ptolemy in Egypt, rose up against him. In the ensuing civil war, Perdiccas was killed. A new order was established. Antipater would rule Europe, Ptolemy would hold Egypt, and Seleucus would take the vast eastern territories, all supposedly holding the empire in trust until Alexander IV came of age. But when Antipater's son, Cassander, seized power, he had the young king murdered. The dream of a unified empire was dead. Alexander's empire fractured into three great Hellenistic kingdoms: the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedon. In character, Alexander was a man more suited to war than to peace, a restless soul prone to fits of rage when his authority was questioned. Yet he possessed an undeniable charisma, an ability to inspire both awe and devotion. His strategic genius was unparalleled, not only on the battlefield, but also in the monumental task of logistics, of moving, feeding, and supplying a vast army across thousands of miles. His greatest failure, perhaps, was his dream of fusing East and West. The two cultures proved unwilling to truly merge. But perhaps, had he lived longer, even this might have been possible. As he himself once said, he preferred a short life of glory to a long life of obscurity. To understand the present, we must face the past. Subscribe and explore the empires that built and broke our world.